Claire Bennett found out she didn't get the promotion 40 minutes before she found out why. The email from Human Resources was brief and procedurally polite. The second email, forwarded to her by mistake 20 minutes later by an assistant who hadn't realized Claire wasn't supposed to see it, contained the full slide deck from the executive presentation that had decided the outcome, a presentation Claire had never been invited to give, built almost entirely from a framework she had personally written 4 months earlier, presented to the leadership team under the name of her best friend of 14 years, Jordan Petrakis. Claire opened that slide deck at her desk, in full view of her own team, and read word for word in several places, language she recognized because she had typed it herself, in a strategy document she had shared with Jordan 4 months earlier, purely as a courtesy, the way she had shared dozens of documents with Jordan over 6 years of working together as, she had believed until that exact moment, genuine professional equals and genuine friends. This is the story of what happens when professional betrayal and personal betrayal arrive in the exact same envelope, and what Claire did over the following several months to prove, conclusively and on paper, exactly what had happened. Not to get revenge, but because she had built an entire career on the assumption that good work speaks for itself, and she needed, for her own sake, to find out whether that assumption had simply stopped being true, or whether she had been wrong about who she was working beside the entire time. Jordan Petrakis had done this before, in a smaller and far less consequential way, 18 months earlier. Claire didn't find out about that first time until she started looking, and the person who finally told her about it had been carrying that exact knowledge, silently, for over a year. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before we get to what Claire actually built with that proof, I need you to hold 3 questions in your mind, because everything in this story is really an answer to one of them. First, how do you steal a promotion from your own best friend without her noticing for 4 months? Claire and Jordan worked 6 feet apart for 6 years. They had lunch together most days. The mechanics of how Jordan pulled this off without Claire suspecting anything required a specific kind of patience and a specific kind of access that most workplace betrayals don't have available to them. We're going to show you exactly how it worked. Second, did Director Holloway know, or was he played too? Marcus Holloway made the final recommendation that sent this promotion to Jordan instead of Claire. The question this story has to answer is whether he was complicit in any way, or whether he was simply the second person, after Claire herself, that Jordan successfully deceived. And third, what did Claire actually do with the 4 months of proof she eventually built? This isn't a story about an emotional confrontation in a parking lot. Claire built something considerably more methodical than that, and what she built is the reason this story has an ending most viewers do not expect. One more thing before we go back to the beginning. Priya Ramaswamy had watched this exact pattern happen once before. To someone else, 18 months earlier. She said nothing at the time. She has had to live with that decision every day since, and it's the reason she did something very different this time. Claire Bennett and Jordan Petrakis met as sophomores at the University of Minnesota, assigned as roommates in a dormitory neither of them had requested, and built, over the following 4 years, the kind of close college friendship that either fades naturally after graduation or becomes one of the genuine anchors of an adult life. For Claire and Jordan, it became the latter. They stood in each other's weddings, supported each other through Jordan's difficult divorce 6 years later, and, in a coincidence that delighted both of them at the time, ended up applying for jobs at the same consumer goods company within 8 months of each other, entirely independently. Friends from this period have consistently described Claire and Jordan's friendship as genuinely reciprocal and warm, without the kind of one-sided dynamic that sometimes characterizes friendships that later curdle into professional rivalry. Claire, by multiple accounts, regularly advocated for Jordan in rooms Jordan wasn't in, and Jordan did the same for Claire, for most of the 6 years they worked together. That reciprocity held, by every account available, for nearly 5 of those 6 years. The shift, when it began, was subtle enough that neither woman fully registered it as a shift at the time. Claire built a reputation over 6 years as one of the strongest strategic thinkers in her department, known particularly for a methodical, research-driven approach to brand positioning that consistently outperformed flashier, more intuition-based proposals from colleagues. She was also known, consistently and by her own later acknowledgement, for a specific professional habit that several colleagues found admirable and that would later prove considerably more costly than anyone, including Claire herself, anticipated. She rarely advocated loudly for her own contributions, operating on a belief, inherited partly from her own parents' work ethic, that doing excellent, well-documented work was sufficient on its own, and that drawing attention to one's own achievements was a kind of unnecessary, slightly distasteful self-promotion. Claire routinely shared early drafts, working frameworks, and strategic documents widely within her team, and with close colleagues like Jordan, both as a genuine collaborative practice and, by her own later admission, because she had never seriously considered that this openness carried any real risk. She kept informal version histories on her own laptop, largely for her own reference, but had never developed the habit of formally time-stamping or distributing dated proof of authorship for her ideas, since doing so had simply never seemed necessary among people she trusted. This specific habit, generous, undocumented sharing among trusted colleagues, would become the single most important detail in everything that happened next, for reasons that had nothing to do with bad luck and everything to do with exactly who Claire had been sharing with. Jordan Petrakis was, by every account from colleagues across the 6 years she worked at the company, a talented and capable strategist in her own right. With genuine strengths in client relationship management, an executive presentation that consistently exceeded Claire's, who several colleagues described as comparatively reserved and occasionally underwhelming in exactly the kind of high-visibility presentation settings where Jordan thrived. Several colleagues, reflecting after the events of this story became known internally, described a consistent pattern over the years in which Claire's frameworks and strategic thinking provided much of the substantive intellectual foundation for major projects, while Jordan's confident, polished delivery often determined how that work was actually received by leadership, a division of labor that worked well for years, specifically because both women, by every account, genuinely valued and respected what the other contributed, and neither initially experienced it as a hierarchy. Jordan has since acknowledged, in a conversation referenced during the company's internal investigation, that she had struggled increasingly, over the 2 years preceding this story, with a specific and growing insecurity about her own original strategic thinking, a fear, in her own words, that she had built an entire career on being good at presenting other people's ideas convincingly, rather than generating valuable ideas of her own, and that this fear had intensified considerably as both women approached the same narrow promotion window at the same time. That insecurity did not, on its own, make Jordan a different person. What made the difference was a specific opportunity that presented itself 18 months before this story's central event. An opportunity Jordan took, in a smaller and far less consequential way, that nobody noticed at the time except one person. 18 months before the central promotion at the center of this story, Jordan presented a smaller but genuinely valuable client retention strategy to a regional sales team, built substantially on an internal analysis Claire had produced for an entirely different, unrelated purpose and had shared informally with several colleagues, including Jordan, in a department-wide planning document. Priya Ramaswamy, present in that smaller presentation as a representative from an adjacent department, recognized several of the specific data points and structural framing Jordan presented as her own original analysis, having seen an earlier, nearly identical version of the same material in the department-wide planning document weeks earlier. She has since said she assumed, at the time, that this was simply normal cross-functional collaboration, and that Claire had likely been consulted or credited informally, an assumption she did not verify and has since deeply regretted not verifying. Priya raised the observation casually with a colleague at the time, who suggested it was probably nothing, and Priya, lacking any specific reason to escalate what felt, in the moment, like a minor and possibly unfair suspicion about a colleague's working relationship, let the matter drop. She has said she thought about that decision periodically over the following 18 months, with a discomfort she found difficult to fully name until she learned what happened to Claire. That first instance went completely unnoticed by Claire, who never learned about the regional presentation at all. It would not stay hidden the second time. 4 months before the promotion decision, Claire developed what she has since described as the most ambitious and original strategic framework of her career, a comprehensive repositioning strategy for one of the company's flagship product lines, developed over several weeks of independent research and analysis that she conducted largely on her own time, driven by genuine enthusiasm for the problem rather than any specific expectation of organizational reward. Claire shared an early working draft of this framework with Jordan in what she has described as an entirely ordinary act of collegial courtesy, seeking informal feedback before she planned to bring a more polished version to her own direct manager. She shared it through the same informal channels she had used hundreds of times over 6 years, with no expectation that doing so carried any particular risk, because it never had before. Jordan, according to the company's later internal investigation, spent the following several weeks developing her own presentation of substantially the same framework, refining the language and visual presentation considerably, but retaining the core strategic logic, the central data analysis, and, in several specific instances documented later, exact phrasing lifted directly from Claire's original document. Jordan did not present this work to Claire's manager, or to anyone who might have recognized the overlap. She took a different, more deliberate route entirely, one that required identifying a specific gap in the organization's decision-making process that almost nobody else had noticed. The company's promotion process for senior strategist roles included an unusual structural feature that, in retrospect, created exactly the vulnerability Jordan exploited. Rather than requiring candidates to present their own original work through their own direct management chain, the process allowed any senior strategist to request 15 minutes on a quarterly executive review agenda directly, with Director Holloway's office approving requests largely on a first-come, first-served basis, with minimal vetting of the underlying content. Jordan requested and secured a presentation slot on this quarterly agenda 9 weeks before the scheduled date, while Claire, who had not yet finished polishing her own framework to a standard she considered ready for executive presentation, had made no such request, planning instead to bring the work first to her own direct manager through the conventional internal channel once it was further along. This detail matters enormously, according to people who reviewed the situation afterward. Jordan did not need to forge anything or fabricate evidence. She simply needed to move faster and more aggressively through an existing, legitimate organizational process than Claire did, using work that was not yet hers to present, in a system that had no built-in mechanism for verifying authorship before granting access to executive attention. Claire learned about the scheduled presentation only after it had already happened, through the accidentally forwarded email described earlier, by which point Director Holloway had already made his recommendation. Jordan's presentation to the Executive Review Committee, according to 3 people present that day, was, on its own technical and performative merits, genuinely excellent, confident, well-structured, and delivered with exactly the kind of polished executive presence that Director Holloway had consistently responded well to throughout his career, evaluating internal talent. The presentation included, according to a copy of the slide deck later obtained during the internal investigation, Claire's core repositioning framework presented in its entirety, her primary data analysis with only superficial formatting changes, and her central strategic recommendation, framed throughout the presentation using first-person language, phrases like, "My analysis suggests," and "the framework I developed," that left no ambiguity. To anyone watching without prior knowledge of the work's true origin, about whose original thinking they were supposedly seeing. Director Holloway, in a later account given during the internal investigation, described being genuinely impressed by the presentation at the time, specifically citing the combination of strategic substance and confident delivery as exactly the profile he had been looking for in a senior strategist ready for promotion. An evaluation he made in complete good faith, based entirely on the information available to him in that room, with no way of knowing the substance had been authored by someone else entirely. Holloway's recommendation, sent to Human Resources the following day, effectively decided the promotion. Claire found out about all of it 40 minutes after the formal rejection email, through an assistant's mistake that Jordan could not possibly have anticipated or prevented. Claire has described reading through Jordan's slide deck at her own desk as one of the strangest experiences of her professional life. Not because the content was unfamiliar, but because it was so completely familiar that she found herself, for the first several minutes, genuinely confused about how she was looking at a presentation she had no memory of giving. Claire has said the exact moment the confusion resolved into understanding was a single slide containing a sentence she remembered writing, almost word for word, at 11 at night 4 months earlier, sitting at her kitchen table, a detail specific and personal enough that there was no remaining possibility of coincidence or parallel independent thinking. She has said she read that slide 3 times before she closed the laptop entirely and sat very still for several minutes. Claire did not confront Jordan that day. She has said this was not a calculated decision in the moment, so much as a simple absence of any clear idea what to say, combined with a need to fully process what she had just learned before she did anything that might be difficult to take back. She went home that evening and did something she would later describe, to her own surprise, as the first genuinely strategic decision of the entire ordeal. She opened her laptop, found every version and draft of the original framework she had ever saved, and began building a timeline. Claire called Jordan 3 days after the discovery, having spent that time building her timeline and deciding, deliberately, that she wanted to hear whatever Jordan had to say before she decided what to do next. She has said she went into that conversation genuinely uncertain whether there might be an explanation she hadn't considered, a possibility she held on to. She has acknowledged since, longer than the evidence probably justified, because the alternative meant accepting something about a 14-year friendship she did not want to be true. Jordan's first response, according to Claire's account, was an attempt to characterize the overlap as a natural consequence of how closely the two of them had worked together for years, suggesting that ideas had simply blended between them organically over time in a way that made clean attribution difficult for anyone to determine after the fact. Claire has said she might have found this explanation at least partially plausible, if not for the specific, verbatim sentence she had already identified, a detail she raised directly, watching Jordan's face as she did. Jordan did not have an explanation for the verbatim sentence. Claire has described what happened next as Jordan moving, within the same conversation, from the organic overlap explanation to a more direct acknowledgement, framed as an admission that she had been under enormous pressure given the promotion timeline, that she had genuinely believed, in the moment, that the presentation opportunity was simply available to whoever moved on it first, and that she had told herself, unconvincingly even to herself in retrospect, that Claire would eventually have a chance to present similar work through her own channel anyway. Claire asked Jordan one direct question before ending that call, whether this was the first time. Jordan's answer was not a simple no, and the specific way she hesitated before answering told Claire that her own preliminary research, the same evening, had not been a wasted effort. In the weeks following her conversation with Jordan, Claire approached the problem of proving what had happened with the same methodical rigor she had always applied to her actual strategic work, treating the task, by her own later description, as essentially a research project with an unusually personal subject. She recovered time-stamped versions of her original framework document from her laptop's local backup history, established through her email records the exact date she had shared the draft with Jordan, and cross-referenced specific language, data points, and structural choices between her original document and Jordan's presentation slide by slide, ultimately identifying 11 separate instances of language or analysis that matched closely enough to rule out coincidental similarity. Claire also began, cautiously, having informal conversations with a small number of trusted colleagues about whether they had witnessed anything relevant, a process that led her, within 2 weeks, to Priya Ramaswamy, who had been quietly turning over her own 18-month-old observation in her mind, since hearing, through department gossip, a vague and incomplete version of what had happened to Claire. Priya's account of the earlier, smaller incident transformed Claire's case from a single disputed instance into something considerably harder to dismiss, a demonstrated pattern, witnessed independently by 2 different people in 2 separate departments, separated by 18 months. Priya has said her decision to come forward, once Claire approached her directly, was not difficult in the moment, but was shaped considerably by 18 months of quiet discomfort about her own earlier silence, a discomfort she has described as having grown rather than faded over time, particularly as she watched Jordan's reputation and career trajectory continue to benefit from work she had reasonable cause to suspect was not fully Jordan's own. Priya told Claire, in their first detailed conversation about the matter, that she had spent a considerable amount of time over the previous year and a half telling herself that her earlier suspicion had probably been an overreaction, a story she has since acknowledged was more comfortable to believe than the alternative, which would have required her to either confront Jordan directly at the time or report a colleague based on circumstantial pattern matching she could not fully substantiate. Claire has said Priya's willingness to provide a detailed written account of the earlier incident, including specific dates, the names of other people present, and her own contemporaneous notes from the regional presentation, transformed her case from something that rested entirely on her own credibility and memory into something with independent, corroborating substance from someone with no personal stake in the outcome. With Priya's account in hand, Claire made the decision to formally escalate the matter, contacting Denise Fallow in Human Resources to schedule a meeting she had been deliberately delaying for nearly 3 weeks. Denise Fallow's initial response to Claire's complaint, according to Claire's own account, was notably careful and non-committal, a response Claire has said she found frustrating in the moment, but has since come to understand as standard and appropriate practice for an HR function required to investigate fairly before reaching any conclusion, rather than evidence of dismissiveness. The company's formal investigation, conducted over approximately 5 weeks, included a detailed review of Claire's documentary evidence, a forensic comparison of the 2 slide decks, and underlying documents conducted by an external consultant the company retained specifically for this purpose, formal interviews with both Claire and Jordan separately, and a review of Priya's corroborating account regarding the earlier incident. The external forensic review, completed roughly 4 weeks into the investigation, concluded that the similarity between Claire's original framework and Jordan's presentation exceeded what could reasonably be attributed to coincidental parallel development or organic idea blending between close colleagues, identifying specific structural and linguistic markers consistent with direct copying rather than independent original analysis. Jordan, informed that the investigation had reached this preliminary conclusion, made a decision during the final week of the process that several people close to the situation have since described as a serious miscalculation. Rather than acknowledging the forensic findings directly, Jordan's formal response to the investigation, delivered in writing through her own representative during the process, characterized Claire's complaint as motivated primarily by resentment over having lost the promotion, suggesting that the similarities the forensic review identified reflected ordinary professional collaboration rather than deliberate appropriation, and implying, without stating directly, that Claire's own documentation had potentially been constructed or organized after the fact, specifically to support a grievance. This characterization collapsed almost immediately upon scrutiny, for a specific reason Jordan's representative had apparently not fully accounted for. Claire's documentation included email timestamps and laptop backup metadata that predated the promotion decision itself by several months, meaning the foundational evidence of authorship existed before there was any promotion outcome to be resentful about, a timeline that directly contradicted the suggestion that Claire's case had been retroactively constructed. Denise Fallow, in a later account given during a deposition connected to subsequent proceedings, described Jordan's specific characterization of Claire's motives as the single most damaging moment of the entire investigation from Jordan's own perspective, because it shifted the company's internal assessment from a question of ambiguous credit sharing between close colleagues into a clearer question of whether Jordan had also been dishonest during a formal company investigation, a considerably more serious matter on its own. Director Holloway, who had remained largely uninvolved in the investigation process up to this point, was asked directly, during the final review, to account for his own role in approving Jordan's presentation slot and his subsequent recommendation. His response surprised several people present. Holloway, when asked to account for his own process, acknowledged directly and without significant defensiveness that the quarterly executive review's first-come, first-served structure had created an obvious vulnerability that, in retrospect, he should have identified and addressed considerably earlier, given that he had personally overseen the process for nearly 4 years without ever building in a basic verification step to confirm that presenters were credited as the actual originators of the work they presented. Holloway told the investigation, in a statement later shared with Claire directly, that his own preference for confident, polished presentation delivery over more reserved demonstrations of substantive thinking had likely made him a more vulnerable evaluator than he had previously recognized about himself. An admission Claire has said she found more meaningful than she expected, because it suggested a genuine willingness to examine his own judgment, rather than simply treating the situation as an isolated incident of one employee's individual dishonesty. Holloway proposed, as part of the investigation's formal recommendations, a structural change to the executive review process requiring documented attribution and direct manager sign-off before any strategic work could be presented at the executive level, a change the company implemented within the following quarter and that several colleagues have since noted, with some appreciation, as a genuine and lasting improvement that emerged directly from what happened to Claire. The company's final determination, communicated to Claire and Jordan separately within the same week, found that Jordan's conduct constituted a clear violation of the company's intellectual contribution and workplace integrity policies, both in the original presentation and in her subsequent characterization of Claire's documentation during the formal investigation. Jordan was offered the choice between immediate termination with cause or a negotiated resignation effective within 30 days, a choice she ultimately took the second option on, according to people familiar with the outcome, specifically to preserve some ability to characterize her departure neutrally to future employers. The promotion itself, after a brief additional review confirming Claire's underlying framework, met the position's substantive requirements independent of the circumstances surrounding its theft, was awarded to Claire, backdated to the original decision point, for purposes of compensation and seniority. Claire has said receiving the promotion this way, 4 months later, and only after an exhausting investigation, produced a specific and complicated kind of satisfaction that was real but considerably more muted than she might have expected, given how much certainty she had once placed in the idea that good work, eventually, simply gets recognized on its own. Jordan's final conversation with Claire, arranged informally rather than through any company process, in the parking garage on Jordan's last day, was brief and ended with a sentence Claire has said she has thought about more than almost anything else connected to the entire situation. Jordan approached Claire in the parking garage on her final day, an encounter Claire has said she had not planned for and was not certain, in the moment, that she wanted. Jordan told her, according to Claire's account, that she was sorry, that she knew an apology delivered at this point probably meant very little, and that she genuinely did not know, even now, exactly when she had crossed the specific line between admiring Claire's work and deciding she was entitled to claim it. Jordan's final words before she walked to her car were, "I think I convinced myself, somewhere along the way, that being your friend meant I'd earn some kind of share in everything you built. I don't actually believe that. I just wanted it to be true badly enough that I stopped checking." Claire has said she found this sentence more devastating, in its way, than the original theft, because it offered neither a full excuse nor a full villain to be angry at, just a specific, recognizable human failure that she has said she now recognizes, uncomfortably, as a temptation she believes almost anyone could be capable of, under the right combination of insecurity and proximity. Claire did not respond to Jordan in the parking garage beyond acknowledging that she had heard her. She has said she has not spoken to Jordan since, and does not anticipate that changing, though she has also said, unlike some of the more absolute breaks described in other stories she has since read about, that she does not carry active anger toward Jordan so much as a permanent and somewhat sad recalibration of what 14 years of friendship had actually been able to withstand. 8 months later, a detail about what Jordan did next reached Claire indirectly, through a mutual contact, in a way that complicated any simple narrative about consequences and justice being fully and finally served. Jordan secured a new position at a different company within approximately 10 weeks of her resignation, a timeline that several people who followed the situation found notably fast given the circumstances. Though Claire has said she has made a deliberate choice not to investigate exactly how Jordan characterized her departure during that job search, preferring not to know details that she has said would likely only generate additional anger without changing anything material about her own situation. A mutual contact, who had no direct knowledge of the full situation, mentioned to Claire in passing, months later, that Jordan appeared to be doing well in her new role, had received positive informal feedback from colleagues there, and seemed, by external appearances at least, to have moved forward from the entire episode with minimal lasting professional damage, a detail Claire has said she found genuinely difficult to sit with, since it directly contradicted any narrative in which serious wrongdoing reliably produces serious, lasting consequence. Claire has said she has worked, in the time since learning this, to separate two things she initially found tangled together: her own sense of whether justice was served within the specific situation she had standing to address, which she believes it largely was, and a broader, more philosophical disappointment that the world does not reliably continue punishing people once they leave the specific room where their wrongdoing was discovered. A disappointment she has said she suspects most people eventually have to make some peace with, in one form or another, if they want to remain functional. Priya Ramaswamy, watching this same outcome unfold from a slight distance, found herself thinking about her own decision, 18 months earlier, to stay silent about the first incident, and reached a conclusion about that decision that surprised her. Priya has said that watching Jordan land relatively smoothly in a new position, after everything that had happened, initially made her wonder whether her own decision to finally come forward, 18 months after first noticing the pattern, had actually mattered as much as she had hoped it would when she finally did it. She has since arrived at a different way of thinking about it, one she described directly to Claire during a conversation the two of them had after the situation concluded, that the value of coming forward was never really about guaranteeing a specific proportional outcome for Jordan, which was never fully within either of their control, but about refusing to let her own silence become one more structural advantage that allowed the pattern to continue unchecked, the way it nearly had during the first incident 18 months earlier. Priya told Claire that she had decided, going forward, that she would rather live with the discomfort of having spoken up about something that turned out, in the end, to produce an imperfect or incomplete consequence, than live again with the specific, corrosive discomfort of having stayed silent, and wondered, indefinitely, whether speaking up might have changed something. Claire has said this reframing helped her arrive at a similar peace with her own situation, considerably faster than she might have otherwise. Claire, now 18 months into the senior role the promotion eventually delivered her, has described the most significant change in how she works as a complete and deliberate revision of the professional habit that made her vulnerable in the first place. She now formally documents and timestamps original strategic work as a matter of routine practice, distributes credit explicitly and in writing when collaborating with colleagues, and has stopped treating visibility and self-advocacy as somehow incompatible with substantive, high-quality work. She instituted, within her own team once she had the authority to do so, a documentation norm requiring dated authorship records for any strategic framework before it could be presented externally or upward, a practice several colleagues initially found slightly bureaucratic and have since come to appreciate considerably, particularly after hearing, eventually, at least a partial version of why Claire had implemented it. Claire has said the hardest part of this adjustment was not the practical mechanics of better documentation, which she found straightforward, but unlearning a deeper belief, inherited from her own upbringing, that good work should be allowed to speak entirely for itself, without the person who produced it needing to actively claim space for it. She has said she now believes that belief, however appealing in principle, had functioned for years as an unexamined risk she had simply never been forced to confront the cost of. This story gets remembered, when people share it, as a story about a best friend who stole a promotion, and it is that. But I think the more interesting story underneath it is about the specific, slow mechanics of how trust gets converted into vulnerability inside long friendships that also happen to be professional relationships. Because nothing about what Jordan did would have been possible without the genuine, years-long trust Claire had extended to her, the same trust that made their friendship real in the first place. And I think what makes this story more than a simple cautionary tale about oversharing at work is the fact that Claire's actual conclusion, in the end, was not that trust itself was the mistake. It was that trust and documentation were never supposed to be opposites, the same conclusion other people in other situations have arrived at when their own assumptions about good faith were tested past their limits. You can genuinely believe in your closest colleagues and friends and still build a paper trail, not because you expect betrayal, but because the absence of a paper trail does nothing to prevent betrayal, and does a great deal to make betrayal easier to get away with when it happens. Jordan's own words in that parking garage, that she convinced herself proximity to Claire's talent entitled her to some share of it, point to something uncomfortable that extends well beyond this specific story, that the people most capable of betraying us in exactly this particular way are rarely strangers. They are, almost by definition, the people who have been close enough and trusted enough to know precisely what we've built and precisely how undefended it actually is. There's a framed document on the wall of Claire's office now. Not a formal award or a corporate plaque, but a printed, dated copy of her original repositioning framework, the same one Jordan once presented as her own, mounted exactly as it looked on the night Claire wrote it, kitchen table typos and all. Claire has said colleagues occasionally ask about it, assuming it must be some kind of significant company milestone. She tells most of them only that it represents a lesson about documentation. She has said, the version of the story behind it is one she now reserves for the people who have actually earned the trust required to hear it completely. Before we go, I want to ask you something, because I think this story raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer, and I'd rather hear your honest take than offer a tidy one myself. Jordan's final words suggested she knew, somewhere underneath the rationalization, that what she was doing was wrong, the entire time she was doing it. I want to ask you directly, does that kind of self-aware admission, offered honestly after the fact, change how you think about what she did? Or do you think the clarity of that final confession only makes the choices that preceded it less forgivable, since she apparently always had access to the part of herself that knew better? Tell me where you land in the comments. I suspect most of us, if we're honest, can think of at least one moment in our own lives where we knew exactly what we were doing was wrong, and did it anyway. And I think that's worth sitting with honestly, rather than only judging from a safe distance. And if this story made you think about the specific risks of mixing close friendship with close professional collaboration, you'll want to see what we're covering next week. Because next week we're telling the story of two business partners, friends for over 20 years, who discovered, only after one of them tried to sell his half of the company, that their original founding agreement had been quietly altered years earlier in a way only one of them had ever known about. Subscribe so you don't miss it. We post a new true story every week. I'm your narrator. This has been Tales of Whisper. The people closest to you are not more trustworthy by default. They are simply the people with the clearest view of exactly what you've built, and exactly how easy it might be to take. Tales of Whisper. Storytelling for the curious mind.